All right, so for this 1 hour session that we have together, I'm really going to switch gears and focus in on problem solving processes. So in some of the work with DPI, we have focused on when teams of people come together to identify a problem and then to develop a plan for intervention. How do we do that in a way where we are, again, continuing to recognize students' strengths, recognizing their assets, but certainly not engaging in practices that might marginalize them in some way. So part of what I'm going to talk about are a couple strategies if you serve on teams, if you work on teams, particularly in schools. What are some of the strategies you can use and to actually bring about that outcome? This presentation is actually a part of a larger one, a larger webinar that is on the DPI website called Culturally Responsive Problem Solving. So I'm only doing a piece of that, a snapshot of that, but if you are interested in more information or more in-depth coverage around culturally responsive problem solving, there is a webinar on the DPI website specifically for this topic. So I want to start out by first just sort of giving the general understanding of problem solving and what we're trying to achieve out of that. So in its most core form, when we're talking about problem solving, we're trying to find a solution to a problem. So, okay, that sounds pretty straightforward, but the process in actually identifying the problem can complicate this. So the process that we generally use in schools, so this is even if you're on an IEP team or RTI team, any kind of team that's coming together to address a concern can really serve as a problem-solving team, okay? So those teams generally follow a 4-stage process. So even if you're a parent that goes to sit on a team, this is a general process that most school-based teams follow. The first step is, okay, let's identify the problem, all right? Then the second step is problem analysis. What data do we need to collect to understand why the problem is occurring, okay? And then once we understand why the problem is occurring, we can design an intervention to help support the student. Once we do that, then we need to evaluate, is it actually working? So whenever you go into a team, these general 4 stages is what the team will progress through to try to understand a problem. The issue though is, what is a problem? Because we know, even in our understanding of what is a problem, we can identify the wrong thing. So at a basic level, a problem is a discrepancy between the current behavior or performance and what is desired. Now, when we're talking about academic skills, okay, that tends to be a little bit easier for us to identify, you know, if a kid is reading on a 2nd grade level as opposed to reading on a 3rd grade level. But when it comes to behavior, social-emotional functioning, that's a lot more subjective in terms of what is the actual desired behavior. So we want to be very careful that we're not trying to identify desired behaviors or functioning that's not appropriate. So, you know, it's like when a teacher will come to you and you have a kid that's, you know, 4 years old and they say, oh yeah, the problem is that they won't sit for 45 minutes. That's developmentally inappropriate. They won't sit for 45 minutes. So we should not put that as a problem. Does that make sense? So we have to listen to people's subjective ways of thinking when they're trying to identify actually what is a problem. So I will say for you, if you're ever sitting on a team, to first always question, is this really a problem? Is it really appropriate? Does that make sense to everybody? Let's just not assume it's a problem because somebody said it was. So we're trying to get that discrepancy and trying to close that discrepancy. So where we know we struggle the most with problem solving, especially in school settings, are the behavioral, social-emotional, and mental health concerns. Those are the areas where we struggle the most. So why do we struggle the most? 1, lack of knowledge. So especially mental health, we just don't understand enough about the child. We don't understand enough about the different areas of functioning. So we're coming up with inappropriate understandings of what the desired behavior is if we really don't understand. There's a wide range of variability. We just talked about neurodiversity this morning. So when we think about the wide range of variability, then people get caught up in terms of what's typical and what's normal. So it may be, oh, well, my kid didn't behave that way. Well, this is not your kid. Okay, you know, there can be a wider range of diversity in terms of how people function, and it's perfectly fine. So we have to make sure we're not reading into that subjectivity. And then individual differences. Kids are just different from each other in temperament and personality. And so sometimes those kinds of differences, like, you know, teacher may say, you know what, we just clash, our personalities are different. Okay, that can't be a problem for the kid then. So we want to make sure we understand individual differences, cultural differences, which is what? Differences in beliefs, values, ways of viewing the world. We can have diversity in how we see and understand the world, and it doesn't mean that we have a problem. And then finally, and the one that causes us a lot of trouble is subjectivity. This is when we're complicated by our own biases, stereotypes, and prejudices about people. And this is feeding into how we see a problem. So all of these factors complicate the simple process of identifying what is the problem. So my first takeaway is to always question, is this a problem? Or are we holding biases? Are we setting inappropriate standards? Are we taking just typical differences and making them something that's pathologized? Those are the kinds of questions we should be asking right off the beginning when we're talking about problem-solving processes. Do not just sit and say, because someone came into the room and said, this is a problem, we accept it as a problem. Does that make sense? You can ask the question first. Is it a problem? So let's talk about then, how do we actually start to use some strategies to better identify the problem so we can actually support the student? So a culturally responsive problem-solving process, it sounds super fancy, like, oh, Marquita's gonna come up here and talk about some kind of magic. No. It basically is saying that there's diversity. There's always diversity in every single thing that we're doing. Every time we're serving kids and families, that's okay, that we can think, feel, behave in different ways. And so culturally responsive problem solving is just basically saying we need to recognize and embrace that difference. And that means that not everybody's gonna get the same thing. Because the differences matter in the sense that we wanna make sure we're supporting people in addressing what they actually need. So only thing we're saying with cultural responsive problem solving is that, yes, we have diversity, we embrace that diversity, and that means that not everybody will get the same thing. So if you're on a problem solving team and they just have a list of interventions and they're like, this one, this one, this one, you're like, that is not individualized enough to actually meet the actual needs that the child may have. Because that one-size-fit-all approach may not work. So when we're talking about culturally responsive problem solving, we're not talking about one tool or one intervention. It really is a way of thinking. We're talking about a way of thinking. The problem identification step, the first step, is the most important part of the problem solving process. Why is that? Because it drives everything else. If we're off on this piece, the process is off. The process is much less likely to work. We come up with the wrong data, we come up with the wrong intervention. And then instead of saying, we got the problem wrong or we're focusing on the wrong issue, we then say, something must be wrong with the student that they're not responding to this intervention. We want to not do that. We want to say, did we go about a process to actually get to the right intervention instead of saying the student didn't respond, so something is wrong with the student. We could be off in how we're identifying the problem. So let's talk about what that looks like. We're going to talk about two strategies, and anybody sitting at the table on the team can use these strategies to help us accurately identify the problem. These are the only two strategies we're going to talk about today. If you want to do more, the webinar is on the DPI website. So when you're on a team and you're starting to identify a problem, you want to reframe deficit-based conceptualizations, which I'm going to talk about that. What does that mean if they are occurring on your team? And then make sure you're identifying hypotheses that can actually address the problem. So we're going to talk about these two pieces. What are we talking about when we say reframe deficit-based conceptualizations of a problem? Sometimes people will say, okay, if we're talking about a kid who's having difficulty with reading, and we say that the student doesn't have the reading fluency skills, right? Okay, that is, something that the student is lacking, right? Not having those reading fluency skills. Saying that in and of itself is not deficit-based. It's just saying the student doesn't have these skills, whether they're social skills, some communication skills, whatever, academic skills. Okay, we need to recognize if a student does not have those skills so we can work on building those skills. That's not what I'm talking about when I say deficit-based. When I say deficit-based, we're talking about when people are saying some part of a person's identity is the reason why they're having a problem. Oh, you know what, this family, they live in poverty, so that's why John is having trouble reading. That's deficit-based. Do you understand what I'm saying? Oh, this student has ADHD, that's why they can't do X, Y. That's deficit-based. It's taking some part of who you are and making it the reason why the problem is existing. Remember, as we talked about this morning, we're moving away from problematizing people to instead saying what systems aren't working to support the student. Do you understand what I'm saying? So deficit-based is any time we're taking a part of a person's identity and saying that is the problem. So what we want to do when that happens is reframe. Reframe helps us take that problematizing of a person and switch our thinking to focus back on systems. That's a strategy that you use. So if you are in a meeting and you hear that deficit-based thinking, what we're going to talk about are strategies for you to say something to switch it off problematizing the student back into problem-sizing systems. Does that make sense to everybody? Because you might hear it and you're like, oh gosh, of course they're blaming that the kid lives in poverty. Of course they're blaming that the kid, has ADHD. And you're like, I don't know what to do about it. So we're going to give some language around that. Okay, we're going to give some language around that. So there are three ways that deficit-based conceptualizations commonly come up when we're talking about problem-solving teams. So those three ways are unfounded attributions. Attributions are basically what we attribute the problem to. What do we think is the cause of the problem? So sometimes people come up with causes that are unfounded. Unfounded. This means that there's no evidence to suggest that this is true. We have no evidence to say this is true. The second category is untrue attributions. That's just not true. That's just not true information, so we need to change our thinking. And then the final one is unalterable. There are things that we cannot change, but it doesn't mean that there aren't things that we can do. Does that make sense to everybody? So when we think about deficit-based conceptualizations, let's start with the unfounded. So a common one we hear on teams is that a person may say that the parent is lazy or doesn't care about the child's education. And that's why the student is struggling, having behavioral difficulties or social difficulties or whatever it might be. And one of the things that I ask is, how do you know that? Now, that can be your question on a team. If someone says that on a team, that the parent doesn't care about their child's education, my question would be, how do you know that? What evidence do you have that that is true? Did you talk to the parent and they told you that they don't care about their child's education? Likely not. So what are we doing? Making assumptions. We don't want to do that. Does that make sense? We don't want to do that. And even if you have a parent that is not as involved in a child's education, it does not absolve educators from doing their job. If the parent never calls you back, you still need to do your job. And sometimes people say, oh, if the parent didn't do this, then I can't do that. No, you still do your job. So an example of an unfounded attribution is any time a person is making an assumption about a person's identity and they have no evidence that that is actually true. A second example, or another example with the untrue attribution, is that any time that a person is saying that some part of a person's identity is the problem, that is untrue. Your race has nothing to do with if you're misbehaving. Living in poverty doesn't mean you can't read. Having a disability doesn't mean that you can't go on to do great things and have aspirations and careers and so on and so forth. Anytime you're connecting a person's identity to a problem, that is not true. So you have to say to your colleagues or to educators that you're working with, you know what, there is no data that says that there is a causal relationship between having this identity and this outcome, or this identity and this behavior. We want to move people away from the identity, problematizing identities. Now you might say, oh, well, you know, we have students who, let's say more of the black students are disruptive or misbehaving. Okay, but then let's understand their experience. How are they treated in the school? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes. How are people treated? How are they supported? Because yes, then we can have a relationship there with their identity, because it's how we're treating them in the world. It's not that their identity is a problem. It's how we're treating them that's the problem. And so we're always trying to break these kinds of untrue attributions with actual facts. And then in the unalterable, these are things that maybe we can't change them. And people say, oh, well, this student has this disability, there's nothing we can do. No, that is also not true. You cannot let people say, oh, we can't change this, so that means that we don't need to act. We don't need to do anything. I have been many times where people say, oh, this student has ADHD. Oh, this student has an emotional behavior disorder. Okay, we can't do anything about it. So we have to make sure that these deficit-based conceptualizations are directly addressed. They have to be directly addressed in the problem-solving process. So what could that look like? I just want you to think about attributions that you may have heard if you've ever been on a team. If you've ever been on a team, what kinds of attributions have you heard in that experience? Can anybody give me some examples? Remember, attributions are the factors that people say are causing the problem. This student is having X problem because.
For my son's IEP, they have said one of the goals literally started out due to his learning homelessness.
Wow. Wow. See, you don't even have to make it up. You do not have to make it up. I'm going to go here and then.
Repeat it for the microphone, what she just said.
Oh, she said that she went into a meeting and they literally said, due to her son's learned helplessness, then blah, blah, right? Then the rest of it, right? Yeah.
We also had one of our IEPs due to past traumatic experiences and or poverty-ridden circumstances, this child needs
Due to past traumatic experiences or poverty, yes.
I was just last Monday called into a meeting and told that my son would not be tolerated, his behavior would not be tolerated, or else, like, basically, threatened.
Wow.
Told me that we talked with him, they said that he would not be tolerated, his behavior would not be tolerated, and then they went on to tell me that they met with him after an incident and told him that if he wanted to resign at the school, that he needed to change. And I tried to keep myself together and tell them that it is not him that you should be saying that you're not going to tolerate. It is his disability.
Right. So she was saying that she was called into a meeting and told that they were not going to tolerate her son's behavior anymore. And she was trying to reframe that around how they should have their rethinking. Did I see another hand? So when we hear these things on a team, we might say, maybe then that doesn't seem right. That sounds like it could be a problem. How could it be a problem if we're thinking that way? How could it be a problem if someone is thinking this way? Any of these unfounded, untrue, or unalterable attributions. How could that be a problem? It's important that we address these types of attributions, because if a person believes that they have no power to change a situation, they are less likely to take any steps at all. So if you have a teacher who believes that a kid is misbehaving because the parents don't care, what's my job? If we have a child who is having reading difficulties because I say that they live in poverty, what's my job? Do you understand what I'm saying? It completely strips away any responsibility of educators when we can blame outside factors that are probably not even true or unfounded, or there's no basis for it. We have no reason to do anything. Why would I change my teaching practices if it's because the parent doesn't care? Or if it's because the student has a disability? Why would I change my practices? Do you understand what I'm saying? So this is why we have to reframe. We don't let that linger in the air, because it influences how people's agency, how much they think they should do and that they can do. We want to reframe so that, one, you're not having these wrong attributions, but that everybody has agency to do something. We can do something. So how do we reframe? How do we reframe? So with unfounded attributions, you can say, like I said, if they say the parent isn't, if the parent is lazy, let's go with that example, then you can say, we don't have the evidence that that is true, so that cannot be a reason that we move forward with as a team as to why the student is having this difficulty. We're going to directly say that this is not true. We do not have evidence for that. Do you understand what I'm saying? We do not have evidence for that. That cannot be a reason as to why this student is having a problem. What about the untrue ones? This is where we have to make sure we have the correct information. So if a person says, oh yeah, this child is having this behavioral difficulty because they live in poverty, there is not one piece of data in the world that says that living in poverty means that you're going to have behavior problems. It is just not true. But if we sit at that table and say, we just go along with it. No! We have to give correct information to break down these kind of stereotypes, these biases, these prejudices that show up when we're trying to serve people. Yeah, I heard, I don't know where I read it. I heard it one day, but, if kids have autism, they just can't do these things. Where'd you get that from, ma'am? Where's that? Where's your evidence? I just heard it. No. Every time we let it go by, it stays in the process. If somebody in the room heard that and said, nothing for us to do, this is naming it and then correcting it. And you don't have to be mean and nasty. I can see that in you all, that you want to be mean and nasty. I can see it in you, okay? We're not going to be mean and nasty. We're going to say, you know what? Thank you for sharing that, but we have no evidence that that's true. And actually, the research that we do have says that that's not true. So again, we don't want to operate on that kind of misinformation when we're trying to serve children and families. That's you speaking at the table. It completely changes the dynamic of the process. And sometimes that can be hard. I get that. I get it. It can be hard. But when it's hard for you, I always say, remember, you are there to advocate for children who cannot be there doing it themselves. That's why you're there. That is why you are there. So even if it's hard for you, think about why you're there, to get your courage. Final, unalterable, things that we cannot change. Again, you can say, you know what? No, we can't change that Johnny has a disability, but this is what we can do. This is what we can do. No, we cannot change that Johnny has a parent that's incarcerated, but this is what we can do. We don't let people get out of their responsibilities because it may be a factor that we cannot change. There's always something we can do. Are we all clear on these? Thoughts about this idea of unfounded, untrue, and unalterable attributions. What are your thoughts about this? And your own experiences? Yeah.
I really appreciate the language for us to stand up and be co-conspirators in this work, and I do think it's important to practice that language because we want to keep relationships.
That's right.
We want to bring them along with us in this work.
Exactly right.
Like these language prompts, I think are critical.
Absolutely. We're not adversarial. We're not adversarial. That's why I always say, it feels like you want, like, oh gosh, I need to just tell somebody off. It feels like that. But what comes out of my mouth is going to be, thank you so much for sharing that. Now let me say this. Do you understand what I'm saying? Because you're right, we have to keep the relationships. And this is also education. This is education for people. You can always ask the question, what evidence do you have for that statement? You can always ask people that. If they say, you know what, I don't have any, okay, then if we don't have the evidence to support it, we can't make it a part of our process. Do you understand what I'm saying? If this is misinformation, we can't have misinformation as a part of our process. Because it changes what we do. And it's just saying it just as simply as that. It's not an argument. It's not a back and forth. We're just trying to make sure we're clear that we're operating on true information that we can support. Instead of allowing what you think, feel, might have heard, might have wondered about, not sure about, enter our process. Because that's when we get flooded with bias, stereotypes, and prejudices. What I am saying to you, what I am saying your charge is to not allow that to be in your process. The biases, prejudices, and stereotypes are not true. So you're going to just simply say something. So let's look at some examples and see if we can identify what the attribution is and how we could reframe it. I'm going to just read it out loud. Ms. Smith comes to problem-solving team with a concern about Robert, a white male student in her 4th grade classroom. Below is her description of her concerns. Robert is reading below grade level and he is exhibiting a number of disruptive behaviors in class. He is oftentimes talking to other students, does not follow directions, and will sometimes talk back to me, which causes big disruptions in class. I tried talking to him and keeping him in for recess, but nothing seems to work. I think he is getting worse. I reached out to Mom a few times, but I've not heard back from her. I know she and her boyfriend were having problems, so there may be something there, I don't know. I'm not sure even if she knows what's going on with Robert. Poor kid. I need some help because I do not know what else to do. What I want you to do is just take a few minutes thinking about this example. What do you think the teacher's view of the cause of the problem is, the attribution? Just based on this description, what do you think that the attribution is? And is it unfounded, untrue, or unalterable? And is there a need to reframe? So we're saying that she says, I reached out to Mom a few times, but I've not heard back from her. I know she and her boyfriend were having problems, so there may be something there, I don't know. I'm not sure if she even knows what's going on with Robert, poor kid, so I need some help because I don't know what else to do. What is the attribution there?
Non-interested parent.
That's right, that the parent is not interested, she has other things going on at home, and she's not paying attention to Robert. Is that something that we just let go in a team meeting, or do we need to reframe this? How would we reframe it? Give me an example. You're at the table, you're with the team. What do you say?
I would probably mention that I've reached out and then maybe as a team ask if anybody's been in contact with the parent and then ask if they have a different phone number to try try, or have they contacted via email, or just give a different resource to try?
So we can start out, even before we reframe, we can say, has there been contact? Do we know what actually is happening at home? Do we actually know that? Whoa. Okay, we might not even know. What else? How could you reframe this? What could you say at the table?
Let's look at the skill-based deficits.
So you want to flip it to talking about the skills.
Yeah.
So do you leave that the teacher is saying, I think there's problems at home with mom, she has a boyfriend, something is going on there. Do we leave that?
No, I mean, you still got to discuss that.
You have to say something. What would you say?
We don't have any evidence to support that.
That's actually true. Especially you've asked, has anybody talked to mom? Has anybody? Actually, no. So how do we know what's going on? I'm just assuming. We're moving away from the assumptions. Now, do we need to reach out to mom?
Yes.
Let's do that then. Instead of making the assumption. Do we understand? Let's not operate on the assumption. Let's actually reach out if we need to. But what we won't do is let this assumption exist unless we actually know that it is true.
Well, and even before reaching out, putting the onus on that family as a, to see if that's the problem, have we discussed, hey, the student who's reading below grade level, what's the content then that you've been presenting?
There you go. There you go. Now we're getting to the real stuff. What is the instruction? What is the curriculum?
Well, I was stuck on the very first bit. She says disruptive behavior, and then she gives this evidence of what that is and talking to other students, not following the directions and talking back. But all three of those can be looked at and thought of in many different ways.
Absolutely.
So I'm just confused at the whole.
Well, but this is the thing. What happens sometimes on teams, a lot of times on teams, when a person comes and presents the problem, we just accept it as the truth. We say, okay. Now, it doesn't mean that the teacher or whoever the person is coming to you and trying to manipulate or lie or whatever. They're giving you their best presentation. What we have to say as advocates is asking the question. Wait a minute. What is this all about? What is the curriculum? What is the instruction? And we're not going to let you blame families. All of that is to just not let us wholesale accept what someone is coming to tell us, especially when it has so much subjectivity, assumption in the process.
Yeah, because I was thinking separate of parental structure, everything can be mastered or handled at the systemic or the school-based one.
Yeah.
One and above instruction through RTI and behavior management.
Absolutely. But what's our quickest way? Oh, something's going on at home, so that means that we're not doing anything about that. If you all can figure out what's going on with mom and her boyfriend, maybe Robert will have a chance. Am I lying? Maybe, this is my favorite one. Maybe Robert just needs some love. What? We're assuming that Robert's family doesn't love him now? Just needs some love, somebody to love him. What? Look, we know what we're talking about, right? What are we saying here today? We're not going to let this go unchecked. It has to be addressed. So when you're reframing, and this is what we're talking about, if the teacher is saying that there's some kind of family turmoil, that's unfounded because we don't know if she has direct knowledge of this. We don't know. Do we need to go and find out? Absolutely, we can go and find out. But what we won't do is actually have this attribution hanging out in the air. And so, yes, we need to reframe this. And you all gave lots of examples of how you can reframe. We can reframe to actually talk about what's happening in the classroom. We can reframe to say, hey, these are our systems of support that we should be providing. We can reframe to say, hey, actually, you don't know that this is actually true, so we cannot operate on this assumption in our process. All of those are ways to reframe. There are lots of ways to get us to what the actual issue is and not just operate on assumptions. So you can ask the teacher if she's spoken it, and that's one of the examples. And if no, then what do we need to focus on? What's happening in the classroom? What's happening in your room? Does this make sense? Let's do it again. You're like, ooh. Examples do we have? Mr. Wallace comes to the problem-solving team with a class-wide concern. They're full class. Below is his description of his concerns. I need some help with the behavior problems in my class. The students get out of their seat all the time. Sometimes they just walk out of the classroom. They are constantly talking to each other, and it's just hard to get them to listen and get any work done. There are a few ringleaders that get it all started, but I just don't know what else to do. I tell them to get back to work. I've kept them after school for a few times, and I sent them to the office. But that isn't really doing anything. I know we have had some kids coming to the school from the south side, which is a predominantly black neighborhood with families with low incomes, and this is a different environment from what they might be used to. But we have to do something. What's the attribution? I could probably ask you all for examples that are worse than this one. And you know it. What's the attribution? What is it that we're saying is the problem here? The cause of the problem?
The kids from the south side.
The kids coming from the south side. Oh goodness. The geography tells us all. The geography is the reason. We have so much data that says the geography is the reason that tells us why kids are misbehaving. Is that unfounded, untrue, or unalterable? Untrue, unfounded. First of all, do you have any data on that? Second of all, there is no research in the world that says if I grow up on the south side, that means that I don't know how to sit down in class. I mean, just play out the logic. Literally, you can say back to a person, so what you're saying is, growing up on the south side means that you can't sit down in your seat. Just saying it out loud. Yes. But if we never say anything, if we just sit there and say, south side. Nothing ever gets challenged. And then this is written out on a kid's behavior plan. Do you know what I'm saying? Because we don't say anything. But then, so do we need to reframe? How could we reframe? You're at the table with Mr. Wallace. What would you say? Yeah.
I asked Mr. Wallace what he's doing in the classroom. What is his teaching style? Maybe there's something he can do to change, make them more receptive.
We can always go back to what's happening in the classroom every day, all day. Let's not get distracted and say, oh yeah, it's all these outside things that we know nothing about that's causing the problem. We can always go back to the classroom. What else could we say?
Well, what's that towards relationship building?
How have you gotten to know your students? How have you gotten to build relationships with your students? What else can we do to reframe his thinking about the kids coming from South Side?
I see behavioral differences in there in both of those cases as being a problem versus being an attribute that these students might have. And recognizing that you may have some true leaders in your classroom that you need to engage and be a part of the process.
Can I reframe from you thinking about deficits to where our assets and possibilities here?
My brain goes to different styles of teaching, like old school where you sit in a desk.
Yes.
12 hours you're there, you got the breaks, so, how is that?
What is your classroom management style? That's exit. What is your instructional approach? It could be actually creating or contributing to the problem. So when we look at this breakdown, black students living on the south side, we got race and SES in there. It's not true because there's another state living on the south side and your geography means that you cannot sit down in a classroom. Okay, and so we need to break that connection. You can tell the teacher that the fact that more black students who live in poverty are in his class is not the reason for the increase in behavioral difficulties, because that is not true. Then we can refocus the teacher on management and creating and then you all added in there instruction, building relationships in order to address the needs of the class. So we're trying to directly break these misunderstandings. That's what we're trying to do, to get people to focus in on how are our systems supporting the kids that are in your class. Because a lot of times we overlook the systems. I've had people say to me, well, you know what, I don't want to talk about the teacher's classroom management because they might not like me anymore because I'm telling them that they're having problems managing their class. And my question is, what is your job? You are there to advocate for the child. You can't say, oh, I'm worried about a friendship with the teacher at the expense of children. And again, you're not being mean and nasty. You're just saying, you know what, let's talk about how you're managing the behavior in the classroom. Let's see if that could be contributing to what's happening, and we can make it a better experience for you and for the kids. Do you understand what I'm saying? That's what we're trying to do, is to break down these misunderstandings so that we can give ourselves agency in the building to make some changes. And also get rid of misinformation about kids and families. Okay. So then, okay, we're talking about reframing, deficit-based conceptualizations. And we're trying to engage the problem-solving process in a way that we're not further marginalizing kids. We're trying to get rid of unfounded information, untrue information, and get rid of people thinking that they have nothing that they can do when we're facing situations that we cannot change. That's what we're trying to do. So you want to identify when any of these types of attributions are occurring. Why? Because if I think that the problem is outside of my area of control, I'm less likely to act. I'm less likely to believe that it's something I can do to fix it. You have to fix the home, you have to fix the community, all of these other things. We're not actually focusing on our own systems in the school that can actually change. So that's why we have to be able to listen, identify the attributions, and directly break them in the process. Does that make sense? That's what, so you say, okay, well, they told you that the reason is that, you know, the kid, you know, has a disability, Marquita. What are you going to replace that with? If I'm telling them no, that this doesn't mean you can't do anything, we still have to have a reason to understand why we might have these behaviors or academic performance occurring. We still want to understand the hypothesis. The hypothesis is telling us why. Why do we think we're seeing this performance, this manifestation? A hypothesis is basically just our inference. It's our best educated inference about why do we think the performance or the behavioral functioning is occurring. The hypothesis, though, should have some key features. One is that it should focus on what we think is causing or maintaining the concern. It has to focus on alterable factors, things that we can change in the school environment. That includes instruction, the curriculum or the task, the student skills, and management. Those are the factors that we can change in a building. Now, some people will look at that and say, well, what about when you have kids who've experienced trauma, right? And we need to try to understand how to support them. Yes, this still fits, because what would we say? In the school environment, if a kid has encountered a trauma, how are we supporting them and helping them cope? Do you understand what I'm saying? We're not saying, oh, they experienced this traumatic event, there's nothing we can do about it. We're not saying that. What we say is, how can we support them around their mental health and help them cope and deal with any of the challenges that they may be encountering due to a trauma? So we're not washing our hands of that. We're just saying, what can we do in the school environment? We're always asking that question. We never, ever, ever give up on a child. We always say, what can we do in that school environment? And the last piece is that it's low inference. And I'm going to explain that in a second. Low inference. So let's break this down. Low inference versus high inference hypotheses. A high inference hypothesis focuses on within person factors. Things we can't see, touch, feel, really have a hard time measuring. So that can be things like personality, IQ, aptitude. When a person says, oh, this person is lazy, they don't care. We're like, okay, how do you measure that? How do you know that? How do you connect that a child is lazy to that they're having a reading difficulty? It's a long road to get from there to there. Does that make sense? Because it's very high inference. It's very difficult for us to see, for us to measure, and then directly connect it to whatever behavior or performance that we're actually seeing in the classroom. That's what high inference means. When we're coming into a culturally responsive problem-solving process, we're trying to instead go low inference. What is low inference? These are factors that we can directly observe and link to the problem. Oh, John is having reading difficulties. Where are we going to go? Reading instruction and curriculum first. Not step back and say, you know what, I just think Johnny doesn't care about the art of reading. Okay, how are you going to measure that? Like, how do you even connect that? But we'll say, the art of reading. Yeah. No. Let's start with the curriculum and instruction. That's most proximal to explaining what's happening in the classroom. John is constantly out of the seat. Okay, we're going to attribute that to, well, you know what? Johnny really just doesn't really appreciate quiet time. How about we look at management? How about we look at management? That's where we start. That is most proximal to what the concern is happening in the classroom, in the school. We have control. We can change these things. Thoughts about this? Low inference versus high inference. We're good? So let's talk about some examples. Johnny is in the 4th grade, but he's comprehending at a 2nd grade level because his reading is not fluent. So in this example, what are we saying the hypothesis is? Johnny's in the 4th grade, but he's comprehending at a 2nd grade reading level because his reading is not fluent. What are we saying that the hypothesis is, the cause? That his reading is not fluent. Is that low inference or high inference? If we're saying that his reading is not fluent, he doesn't have reading fluency skills. It's low. It's low. You know what? And then what would the intervention be? Reading fluency. Yes. As opposed to Michelle is continually getting out of her seat without permission and talking to other students because she acts like that at home. What? I mean, just again, we're just playing logic here. Because she's like, so instead, how about Michelle is continually getting out of her seat without permission and talking to other students because Ms. Smith doesn't have classroom rules and expectations about being out of seat? Let me walk off this stage. Do you understand what I'm saying? Yes. We all jump all the way home. Don't know what's going on, but Michelle must act like that at home instead of realizing right there in the classroom. Okay. But you know what? We will let this stand. And then what's the problem when we let this stand? What's the problem? Michelle and her family. Nobody's going to say anything about Miss Smith. Let's just sit with that for a minute. Does this make sense? Do you all understand what I'm saying? Reflections about this. Is this true? Am I making it up? Is it true?
It's true. It's true.
Give me some of your examples. What kinds of factors have you heard about why a student may be performing in a certain way?
With my son is nonverbal, and before he got to high school, the teachers would say that he was not good with his sign language in school because everybody in my household didn't sign.
Oh my gosh.
But everybody in my house did sign, they just didn't know that.
She said that they were saying that her son wasn't good at sign language because everybody in their house doesn't sign, which again show me the data on that. But then the second piece is everybody in her house did sign and they just didn't know it.
Right. And the killer part is they took sign language at the same school that he went to.
Wow.
Because they had the summer programs and after school programs. In the same school that he went to, they went to after school for sign language.
There you go. Other examples.
But at the time, they were foster kids. They had different names. So they didn't know they were brothers and sisters going to the same school.
Wow. Other examples. What factors have we heard? What hypotheses have we heard? Yeah.
Students would rather engage in social, whatever, attention-seeking behaviors, what have you.
Yeah. They would rather engage in social and attention-seeking behavior, yeah, because they're children. Adults do too. Okay? I mean, but then you say, okay, well, what do we do with that? The next question is, how does that impact what we actually do? We can't do anything with that type of information.
Right. And a lot of times, I have been with families that said that the school system would say that if their real biological father was in the home, it would make a difference.
If their biological father was in the home, it'll make a difference.
That wasn't true either.
No. Okay, so anybody who did not grow up with their biological father, me, and lots of other people, they can be okay.
That's right. That's right.
It can't be a fact if I can give you examples where it's not true. And so we don't want to allow misinformation to pervade our processes. Because a lot of times that misinformation is based on rumor, assumption, stereotype, prejudice, bias. Yeah, Tanisha.
One of the ones that's going around my district right now is that the reason why our achievement gap is not closing for African American students is because they are open enrolled. And so we need to look at open
Whoa.
enrollment.
Wow, you took me to another level. She said that the reason why the achievement gap is not reducing in her school is because the black students are open enrolled. Whoa, that took me to another level.
That was what was said just the other day.
Just the other day. And then you know what? What do we say about that? That's when we have to say something.
Accurate data.
There you go. That's it. That's exactly it. Because it will change how we behave. It will change what we do from an intervention perspective. So we want to make sure that we're always looking at how the hypothesis is related to the intervention. Your hypothesis is going to drive the intervention. That is why the hypothesis has to be alterable. It has to be something we can change. So if your hypothesis is high inference or is focused on unalterable factors, it's unlikely that you're going to actually come up with an intervention that actually matches what you're trying to do. So just keep that in mind, and we're going to recap in a minute. You want your hypothesis, the reason that you have evidence, data to support that this is why we think that this performance is occurring, to drive your intervention. It's like connecting the dots. Does that make sense to everybody? So in this case with Michelle, we want to help the teacher develop clear classroom rules and expectations. That's what we want to do. Does it mean that every time we're going to be 100% right on and effective? No. But we're getting closer. We're getting much closer to being accurate. So what I want to do is walk us back at a couple pieces here to make sure we're getting all of the pieces. So we're going to, hold on one second. I always hate this part, but I want to go back. We're talking about sitting on a team in a 4-stage problem-solving process. That's what we're talking about doing. On your team, people are going to come and present a problem, present a concern, That's okay. What is our first question when we're presented with a problem on a team? What is the first thing we need to ask? Is it a problem? Is it a problem? Now, does that mean that you don't have anything to do? Does it mean that you can say, okay, go back to the class, Ms. Johnson, we're all done? What do you think could still be an intervention in that moment? What could still be an intervention in that moment? So we can say, Ms. Johnson, we want to talk about your perceptions of the students. Is this some way that you may be seeing some performance or behavior in a way that you think it's a problem when it's not? Because we don't want Ms. Johnson keep coming back because she's operating on a misunderstanding or misperception of children. Do you understand what I'm saying? So that can still be an intervention opportunity for Ms. Johnson. To say, explain to me, why did you think this was a problem, Ms. Johnson? Oh, she may not understand developmental differences. Oh, she may not understand cultural differences. Do you understand what I'm saying? That can still be an opportunity to support Ms. Johnson. So we're not coming back to the class over and over and over again. I mean, we're not coming back to the team over and over again. But that's your first question, is it a problem? So then once you say, okay, we do see that there's a current behavior or current performance that's developmentally appropriate, where we want to see the student performing, and we want to try to get them there. Okay? We all agree. But then once we get into our discussion about the problem, we start hearing some of our attributions. Unfounded, untrue, unalterable. So when we start hearing those, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? Reframe. Reframe in a way that we disrupt any thinking that is untrue. This is just misinformation. We want to have evidence for things. If we don't have evidence, no, we can't operate on that. And no, we still have things we can do even when we're looking at unalterable. Does that make sense? These are just statements. Why are they important? Because we want everybody to have agency, that they can do something in the school, in the classroom, to support the student. That's why we reframe. But when we reframe, we're taking away whatever reason they came to the table with. We're taking that away. We're saying, no, we can't operate on that. So we have to replace it with something. What do we replace it with? A low inference, alterable hypothesis that's driven by data. So if you're just sitting at a table and people are saying, well, this is why we think that the problem is occurring, you can just ask, what evidence do we have, and is this alterable? Is this something that we can actually change? You can just ask that question. Do you understand what I'm saying? Almost like a check. Are we doing that? What do we mean low inference? We mean that it's directly observable and most directly linked to the problem. We're not going to jump over instruction. We're not going to jump over curriculum. We're not going to jump over assignments. We're not going to jump over management to get all the way to within person factors, home life, all of that. If there is a scenario in which there is disruption happening at home, because that could be true. It could be true. What you have to do then is find out, is whatever's happening at home having an impact on what the problem is that's coming to us today. And so how do you do that? Maybe I need to talk to Johnny to say, I know that there's a lot going on at home right now, Johnny. How is that impacting you? Instead of me assuming that Johnny is acting out in class because of what's happening at home. It could be for a different reason, like Ms. Johnson doesn't have classroom management, even though there are problems happening at home. Do you understand what I'm saying? We never assume. We never assume. So even if there's chaos or problems or something happening at home, we need to know, does that have anything that's to do with what's happening here at in the school with Johnny? It may or may not. Once we get that low inference alterable hypothesis, then you know what we do? Make an intervention. We walk right into that intervention. That intervention should target that hypothesis. And you collect data to see if it's working. Somebody said, well, how is this culturally responsive? What is the culturally responsive? The culturally responsive is accuracy. It's not allowing our biases, our prejudices, our stereotypes, our assumptions to drive our decision making. That's what's culturally responsive. Does that make sense? So this is what we need to do. Just those two things completely changes how you identify a problem. We're not pathologizing kids. We're not promoting deficits in kids. What we're doing is saying, how do we make the school environment more responsive to the needs of this student? Because you're going to be changing curriculum, instruction, the task, management. Does that make sense? Building skill. That's what you're targeting. And then that changes the entire problem-solving process. It changes everything else that you do.
When you're talking about systems change earlier, how do you help a school district see their biases if there's a power dynamic and a bias experience?
Right. So when so with their power dynamics there, and even when your voice is at the table, it may not change what's happening in the room. So this is why I think this work happening with DPI and also with the districts is really important, because those people do also have to recognize this. So you as an advocate at the table, yes, you need to do it too, but we also have to have systems in place that will hold educators accountable in that power dynamic. So that's why I say when I'm talking with DPI, when I'm talking with the districts, where are your systems to protect families from biases and prejudices and stereotypes of your personnel? You cannot ask people one-on-one to change all of these systems, especially with the power dynamics. And so that's been my work with them, is that you all need to curate policies and procedures that empower people to speak up, that empower people to say, no, we're operating on biases and stereotypes, and that's okay for us to say and talk about and do something about. Because I agree with you completely. I agree with you completely. But you know what DPI called me? We'll see. Yes.
Where's the web marketing and what?
It's on the DPI website. If you just type in culturally responsive problem solving, it'll pop up. Now, questions and answers. Q&A. Questions, comments?
I think a lot of times schools will take what, especially like a young child says, as fact.
Yes.
So mom's not reading me at home, so that's the problem. He's not being read to at home. So how do we address that idea of honesty and of truth and fact against what a child is saying without like undermining that?
Right. Well, I think all of it is, as somebody said earlier, having that curiosity, right? We're going to still try to reach out and talk with families, right? We also want to keep dialogue going with kids, you know, and so in that process, when we're navigating and talking with both of them, we can then try to find out what's the truth. Does that make sense? Because we may not know just talking to one person, for example. So we're always trying to figure out, the key for us is that we don't operate on anything that we can't have confidence in the evidence. So we need to do the work, which may be some extra steps, that I need to talk to families, talk to kids, maybe even I need to go and observe in the classroom. Because I'm not going to take wholesale what the teacher is saying. I'm going to go and look in the classroom to see, oh, you said you follow a set of procedures. I go in the classroom, you're not following procedures. So we're trying as much as possible to get as much objective information and bring it all together as possible so that we can rely on the best evidence.
So how do you, as a parent of a kid that perhaps doesn't have, is minimally verbal, have that objective check and balance to go in and observe in a classroom if school districts are saying, I'm sorry, parents aren't allowed.
Oh my gosh. That's when we have to think about parents' rights, because parents can go into the building and observe their teachers. So if in any way, and this may be a good, and I don't know if DPI does this, but where is the education of parents on their rights from an objective source? That needs to be an ongoing process to say, here are your rights, you can do this, and if you run into any problem, here is where you can go. Because that's a parent right. And what we're doing is disempowering people by not educating them on their rights. And that's for every parent in the building. So we need to think about how are we actually communicating that out so people know what they can do. Because I agree with you. That is just going to be complete marginalization of families. Because you need to be able to go in and sit in the classroom. You can show up anytime, day or night. You don't have to announce it or anything. You can walk right in the door.
No, you can't. Like, you would think that, and I actually spoke to DPI about that. It's all dependent per district. The districts can say, I'm sorry, due to confidentiality, blah, 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 blah. No, you can't go in the classroom, whatever you want.
DPI says that districts can make their own policy on that.
That was their,
Right. Yes.
But you know what? We have an attorney who's right here in Milwaukee, Susan Gramlin. Her background in education, especially special education, she came out to Parent University, where I'm the founder of, and told my parents about their rights. And you better believe my parents know. They can go in that classroom, but you gotta be captain to go in there. You can't go in being crazy and stuff like that. But you can go in the classroom anytime you want to. And I experienced it. My son's interpreter was taken away. So I'm like, what is he doing in school without an interpreter? He took the interpreter away because the interpreter didn't live in Milwaukee. But they said they had to live in Milwaukee County. So anyway, they changed it. But when I went to the school, my son was running around playing with a football and everybody else was doing teacher-directed activity.
Wow.
So I called Channel 6. Channel 6 came and observed that with me. And so, of course, it all changed the same day. But when I talked to Susan, she came out, she talked to my parents because there's a lot of things going on in class that teachers didn't want parents in there because they might see this, this, and this. But you can go in their classroom.
But this is what I would say too, is that you do want to think about where you can leverage your resources. So we're not trying to have, we don't want to have adversarial relationships, right? So where can we come in to say, you know what, can we come into an agreement where I need to periodically come in to just observe and see how things are going? I want to be supportive of what's happening in the classroom. Does that make sense? Like you can enter even in that way, that it's a position of support. Because you're going to try to help the teacher and help your child as well. Not that you're being deceptive, but that you're trying to offer up another way to have some support. So trying to work out even on your own, how can we actually negotiate this and have this as an agreement that we can do it? And also leveraging parent advocacy resources to bring to bear. Because you have to be able to see what's happening in order to know if your child is getting the supports and services that they need.
Another strategy.
Really quick, Jill. I know you,
Okay,
Jill.
yeah.
We have 5 minutes now to switch rooms.
Okay.
So really
real
quick, or
just
can you
use
grab
the
her afterwards?
strategy of your IEP team and put this under family engagement.
There you go. That's great. Yes, that's exactly it.
And then just follow the school policy on visiting.
But put it in the IEP.
Put it in the IEP that you're...
And if they say no, say, I have a right to prior written notice. Please write this, give me this in writing, and explain your denial, explain your reasons.
There you go. Thank you all so much.